John Miller never expected to find himself in a courtroom that Tuesday morning. The sky outside was clear blue, a beautiful April day that should have found him tending to his small garden or sitting on his front porch. Instead, the 68-year-old former Marine sat nervously in the back row of courtroom 4B in the Riverside County Courthouse, his weathered hands gripping the handles of his wheelchair. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and old paper. John had arrived 30 minutes early, a habit from his military days. Early is on time is late. His drill sergeant had drummed into him nearly 50 years ago. Those words still echoed in his mind as he positioned his wheelchair in a spot where he wouldn't block the aisle. A few other people sat scattered around the room. A young couple whispered to each other near the front. A tired-looking woman with 3 children tried to keep them quiet on the bench across from John. A court officer stood by the door, eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. John smoothed down his tie for the 5th time. He hadn't worn one since his nephew's wedding 3 years ago, and the knot felt tight against his neck. His blue suit jacket, taken out of the plastic dry cleaning bag just yesterday, still smelled faintly of chemicals. But John believed in showing respect, especially to a judge, even if the reason he was here felt so trivial. The dispute with his neighbor, Doug Peterson, had started 6 months ago. Doug had decided to build a new fence, claiming it was on his property. John disagreed. The property line, according to the papers John's father had left him, ran 2 feet farther than where Doug wanted to put the fence. It wasn't a huge distance, but it would cut into the small side yard where John grew his tomatoes. Those tomatoes had won 2nd place at the county fair 3 years running. Talking hadn't helped. Doug was new to the neighborhood, having moved in just last year after the Hendersons had sold their place and moved to Florida. He was younger than John by at least 20 years, worked in insurance, and seemed to think John was just a confused old man who didn't understand property lines. "Mr. Peterson, I've lived in this house for 40 years, John had tried to explain one afternoon. "My father built it with his own hands in 1952, and I know exactly where our property ends." Doug had just smiled that tight smile of his. "Well, I've got the surveys right here, Mr. Miller. Times change, records get updated. This is where the line is now." John had tried to be reasonable. He'd shown Doug the original property maps, the ones with his father's neat handwriting in the margins. Doug had barely glanced at them. So here they were in court because sometimes being neighbors wasn't enough to solve problems. The door at the front of the courtroom opened, and a woman in a black robe entered. Everyone who could stand did so immediately. "All rise," called out the bailiff, a tall man with a buzz cut who reminded John of his old platoon sergeant. The Honorable Judge Patricia Grant presiding. John straightened his back as much as he could from his wheelchair. Judge Grant moved to her seat with brisk efficiency. She was in her mid-50s with dark hair streaked with gray pulled back, in a tight bun. Her face was stern, her mouth set in a straight line. She had a reputation throughout Riverside County for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for wasted time. "Be seated," she said, not looking up as she arranged papers on her desk. The small crowd settled back down. John noticed Doug entering from a side door with a man in a suit who must be his lawyer. Doug caught John's eye and gave a small nod. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. He looked confident in his crisp white shirt and dark blue tie. John had decided against hiring a lawyer. His fixed income from his military pension and Social Security didn't leave room for legal fees. Besides, he believed the truth was clear enough if someone just looked at the right papers. The clerk began calling cases. John listened as minor disputes and small claims came and went. A fender bender settled with an insurance payment. A disagreement between a landlord and tenant over a security deposit, the young couple from the front being ticketed for excessive noise at their apartment. Outside the tall windows, clouds began to gather, turning the bright morning into something more uncertain. John felt sweat gathering under his collar. His legs might be gone, but he could still feel phantom pain where they should be, especially when he was nervous. And he was nervous now. The judge was exactly as severe as he had heard. Case number 47291, Peterson versus Miller, property line dispute. The clerk finally called. John unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair and pushed himself forward. Doug and his lawyer stood on the other side of the small court. The wheels squeaked, slightly on the polished floor, the sound seeming very loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Peterson, you're the plaintiff in this case?" Judge Grant asked, looking at Doug. "Yes, Your Honor," Doug replied, standing very straight. "And Mr. Miller, you're representing yourself today?" she asked, finally looking at John. "Yes, ma'am," John said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Judge Grant's eyebrow rose slightly at being addressed as ma'am rather than Your Honor, but she didn't comment on it. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice firm and clear, "please rise. For the court." The silence that followed felt heavy. The bailiff, Officer Sam Carter according to his name tag, shifted his weight and cleared his throat. The clerk stopped typing. Even Doug looked uncomfortable suddenly. "Your Honor," Officer Carter said quietly, leaning toward the bench. He whispered something to Judge Grant, whose eyes widened slightly as she finally took a proper look at John, noticing his wheelchair for the first time. John felt a flush of embarrassment rise to his face. He was used to being overlooked sometimes, to people not immediately noticing his disability. Usually it didn't bother him. He had lived without his legs for longer than he had lived with them. But here, in this formal setting, with everyone watching, he felt exposed. "I would stand if I could, Your Honor," John said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. He kept his back straight, his chin up, the way he had been taught in the Marines. Even sitting, John Miller knew how to show respect. Judge Grant's face changed, the stern lines softening just slightly around her eyes. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she set down her pen and really looked at John. She noticed the small Marine Corps pin on his lapel, the way he held himself with military bearing even in his wheelchair, the empty space where his legs should have been beneath his neatly pressed pants. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice different now, "there's no need. The court recognizes your presence." From his seat across the aisle, Doug Peterson was watching with a strange expression on his face, as if seeing John for the first time. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but Doug shook his head slightly. "Before we begin," Judge Grant continued, "I'd like to know a bit more about both parties." She looked at her papers. "Mr. Peterson, you've owned your property for 14 months, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Doug replied. "And Mr. Miller," she turned back to John, "your records indicate you've owned your property since 1983? "Yes, Your Honor," John said. "But my father built the house in 1952. I grew up there and I bought it from my parents when they retired to Arizona." Judge Grant nodded slowly. "So you've known this property line for some time?" "All my life, Your Honor," John replied. Something in his voice must have caught her attention because Judge Grant studied him more carefully. "Mr. Miller," she said, "would you mind telling the court about your service? I notice your Marine Corps pin." The question caught John off guard. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter, if that was possible. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, but it was the judge's gaze that held his attention. There was something in her expression now, something beyond the formal mask of a judge. For a moment, she reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place. "Who?" "United States Marine Corps, 1972 to 1978, Your Honor," he replied, the words coming automatically. "2 tours in Vietnam, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." As he spoke, John sat even straighter in his wheelchair, his shoulders square, his chin lifted. In that moment, despite the gray in his hair and the lines on his face, anyone watching could see the young Marine he had once been. The courtroom remained silent after John spoke about his service. Judge Grant's eyes stayed on him, and for a moment, it seemed like she had forgotten about the property dispute completely. Even Doug Peterson was watching John with new interest, his earlier confidence fading into something that looked almost like shame. "And your injury?" Judge Grant asked quietly. Her voice had lost its sharp edge. Now it carried a gentle tone that surprised everyone in the room. John took a deep breath. He didn't talk about this often. Most of his friends already knew the story, and strangers usually didn't ask. But there was something in Judge Grant's eyes that made him want to answer. April 17, 1975, during the evacuation of Saigon, John said. The memories rushed back like they always did when he spoke of that day. The noise, the fear in the air, the crowds of desperate people. I was helping evacuate civilians when a shell hit nearby. As he spoke, John could almost smell the smoke again, feel the heat of the explosion. His hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. Our unit was assigned to help with the evacuation, he continued. There were so many people trying to get out before the city fell. Women, children, families who had worked with Americans. They knew what would happen if they were left behind. Outside the courtroom windows, rain had started to fall, tapping gently against the glass. The sound reminded John of helicopter rotors, a sound that still sometimes woke him from sleep. We were loading people onto helicopters at the embassy, John said. His voice remained steady, though his eyes looked far away. I was helping a mother and her 3 small children. The youngest was just a baby. They were scared, and the mother couldn't carry all of them at once. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in front of her. The clerk had stopped typing, caught up in John's story. Even the children who had been fidgeting earlier were quiet now, sensing the importance of what was being said. I picked up the 2 older children, one under each arm, John continued. We were running toward the helicopter when the shell hit about 20 yards away. I remember turning my back to shield the children. Then nothing until I woke up in a field hospital. John paused, remembering the white ceiling of the hospital tent, the smell of antiseptic, the moment when he tried to move his legs and couldn't feel them. Did they make it? Judge Grant asked softly. The family? John nodded, a small smile breaking through the serious memory. Yes, I found out later that another Marine got them onto the helicopter. They made it to the USS Liberty, and eventually, to California. The mother wrote to me in the hospital. Her name was Kim. She named her 4th child after me. He'd be about 50 now. Doug Peterson shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him, probably suggesting they redirect the conversation back to the property dispute. But Doug shook his head. He was looking at John with new eyes, seeing not just an old neighbor, but a man who had given a tremendous sacrifice. You were at Walter Reed for rehabilitation? Judge Grant asked. John nodded again, surprised that she knew the standard path for injured servicemen. 6 months, then another year of outpatient therapy before I came home to Riverside. My parents took care of me at first, until I learned to manage on my own. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows. The sound filled the brief silence that followed John's words. Mr. Miller, Judge Grant said, removing her glasses and setting them on the bench in front of her. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. There was something in her voice, a personal note that seemed out of place in the formal setting. John studied her face more carefully. There was something familiar about her eyes, about the way she held herself. If you don't mind my asking, Your Honor, John said carefully, do you have a connection to the military? Judge Grant's composed expression flickered for just a moment. She glanced at the bailiff, then back at John. My father was in the Navy, she said simply. But there was more behind those words, John could tell. Something personal that she was holding back in the professional setting. He was stationed in the South China Sea in '75, she added after a moment. He rarely spoke about it, but when he did... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. John understood. Many who had been there during those final chaotic days of the Vietnam War rarely spoke about what they had seen. The desperation, the hard choices, the people left behind. Those memories stayed with you. May I ask his name and rank? John said. Judge Grant hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. William Grant, Captain U.S. Navy. John's eyes widened in recognition. His hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair even tighter. Captain Grant, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He commanded the USS Liberty during those evacuations. The judge's professional composure cracked visibly. Her eyes widened, and she pressed her lips together as if fighting back emotion. You knew my father? She asked, her voice almost a whisper now. Not personally, John replied. But every Marine involved in the evacuation knew of Captain Grant. John paused, searching for the right words. He coordinated the helicopter. Evacuations from the embassy. His ship took in more refugees than any other in the fleet. Officer Carter, the bailiff, watched the exchange with growing interest. The clerk had stopped pretending to type. Doug Peterson and his lawyer were completely still, witnesses to an unexpected moment of history unfolding in what should have been a routine property dispute. He never forgave himself, Judge Grant said softly, for not being able to save everyone, for having to leave people behind when the order came to pull out. John nodded slowly. None of us did, but your father saved thousands of lives during those operations. He was a hero to all of us on the ground. A tear escaped down Judge Grant's cheek, surprising everyone in the courtroom. Officer Carter discreetly stepped forward, offering her a tissue which she took with a quiet, "Thank you." Doug Peterson looked down at his hands, then over at his lawyer, who seemed equally moved by the unexpected turn of events. The property line dispute that had brought them all here suddenly seemed very small and unimportant. My father passed, away 5 years ago, Judge Grant said, regaining her composure. Lung cancer. But he spoke of those days often toward the end, of the bravery he witnessed, of the Marines who stayed behind until the very last moment to ensure civilians got out safely. John remembered those final hours. The chaos on the embassy roof, the last helicopters leaving so overloaded they could barely stay airborne, the sound of gunfire getting closer as the North Vietnamese army approached. We did what we had to do, John said simply, just like your father. The rain continued to fall outside, a steady rhythm against the windows. Inside the courtroom, something had changed. The formal atmosphere had given way to something more human, more real. Judge Grant was no longer just a stern authority figure, and John was no longer just an old man in a wheelchair. They were connected by a shared history, by events that had shaped both their lives in profound ways. Doug Peterson cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the reason they were all there. But when he spoke, it wasn't about property lines or fences. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice respectful, "I had no idea you were a veteran. My uncle served in Vietnam too. Army, not Marines. He never talked about it much." John nodded in understanding. "Many don't." Judge Grant dabbed at her eyes one last time, then straightened her shoulders, visibly pulling her professional demeanor back around her like armor. But her eyes remained softer than before, her voice gentler when she spoke. "I think," she said, looking between John and Doug, "that perhaps this dispute deserves a different approach than what we originally planned today." Judge Grant took a moment to compose herself, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. The emotional connection that had formed in the courtroom was unusual, and she seemed to be finding her way back to her role as judge. "Given the circumstances," she said finally, "I'd like to suggest we take a short recess. When we return, perhaps Mr. Miller and Mr. Peterson might consider sitting down together to discuss their property dispute with a court mediator before proceeding with formal arguments." Doug Peterson nodded quickly. "I'm open to that, Your Honor." His lawyer looked surprised but didn't object. The change in Doug was clear to everyone in the room. The confident man who had walked in certain of his position now looked thoughtful, even a little ashamed. "Mr. Miller," Judge Grant asked, "would you be willing to try mediation?" John nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've always preferred talking things out." "Very well," Judge Grant said. "This court will take a 30-minute recess. Mr. Miller and Mr. Peterson, please see the clerk who will direct you to a mediation room." She tapped her gavel once, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Court is in recess." As Judge Grant stood to leave, everyone who could stand did so, showing respect as she exited through the door behind her bench. John noticed that she glanced back at him once before the door closed behind her. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, approached John and Doug. "If you'll both follow me, I'll take you to mediation room 2. It's just down the hall." As they moved out of the courtroom, John was surprised when Doug stepped behind his wheelchair. "Let me help you with that," Doug said, his voice different than it had been during their fence discussions. "These courthouse floors can be slippery." John was about to say he could manage. He'd been pushing himself in this chair for decades. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the genuine offer in Doug's voice, or maybe it was the sense that this was Doug's way of extending an olive branch. "Thank you," John said simply, allowing his neighbor to push his wheelchair as they followed the clerk. The mediation room was small but comfortable, with a round table instead of the formal setup of the courtroom. The clerk showed them in and explained that a mediator would join them shortly. When they were alone, an awkward silence filled the room. John looked out the window where the rain continued to fall, turning the world gray and soft at the edges. Doug stood by the table, fingers tapping nervously on its wooden surface. "I didn't know," Doug said finally, breaking the silence. "About your service, about your legs." John turned to look at his neighbor. "We never really talked much beyond the fence issue." Doug nodded, taking a seat at the table. "My father was in Vietnam too, Army. He didn't talk about it much." "Many don't," John said again, as he had in the courtroom. It was a simple truth. Many who had seen combat carried those memories silently. "He died when I was 15, Doug continued. "Heart attack. I always wished I'd asked him more about his life, about his service. But kids don't think about those things until it's too late." John wheeled himself to the table, positioning his chair across from Doug. "It's hard to talk about war with people who weren't there. Even harder to talk about it with your children. You want to protect them from knowing what the world can be like." Doug nodded, understanding in his eyes. The judge, her reaction when you mentioned her father, that was something real. "Captain Grant was a legend during the evacuation," John said. "His ship took in so many people. They were sleeping in the hallways, in the mess hall, anywhere. They could find space. He refused to turn anyone away as long as he had room to squeeze in one more person." Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the window. Inside, the air between the two men had changed. The tension that had built up over months of dispute was fading, replaced by something that felt almost like understanding. "About the fence," Doug said after a moment. "I've been thinking maybe we could—" The door opened and a middle-aged woman with short gray hair entered. She carried a folder and had a name tag that read, "Susan Matthews, Court Mediator." "Good morning, gentlemen," she said with a warm smile. "I understand you're here about a property line dispute?" "We are," Doug said, "but I think we might be close to working it out ourselves." Susan looked pleased. "That's wonderful. Why don't you tell me where things stand now?" Doug looked at John, then back at Susan. "Well, when I bought my house last year, the survey I received showed the property line in one place. But Mr. Miller, John, has documents from when his father built the house that show it in a slightly different place." "About 2 feet different," John added. "It wouldn't matter much, except that's where I grow my tomato plants. Have for 40 years now." "Prize-winning tomatoes," Doug said, surprising John. "Right? I think I saw something in the local paper about you winning at the county fair." John couldn't hide his surprise. "Yes, second place 3 years running, though I was hoping for first this year." Doug smiled, a genuine smile without the tension that had marked their previous interactions. "My wife loves gardening. She was actually disappointed when I told her we might have to move the fence into what's clearly an established garden." Susan watched their exchange with interest, taking a few notes but mostly letting them talk. "Tell you what," Doug said, leaning forward. "What if we leave the fence where it is now? You keep your garden space. In exchange, maybe you could give Karen, my wife, some gardening tips. She's been struggling with getting her roses to bloom properly." John found himself smiling back at his neighbor. "I think we could work with that. My late wife, Margaret, she was the one with the green thumb for flowers. But I learned a thing or two from her over the years." Susan looked between them. "So to be clear, you're agreeing to maintain the current property line as is? No changes to the existing fence?" Both men nodded. "And Mr. Miller, you'll provide gardening advice to Mrs. Peterson as a neighborly gesture, not as a condition of the agreement?" "That's right," John said. "Good neighbors help each other out." Susan made a few notes in her folder. "This is refreshingly simple, gentlemen. I'll draft a quick agreement for you both to sign, and we can present it to Judge Grant when court resumes." As Susan stepped out to prepare the paperwork, Doug looked at John with newfound respect. "I'm sorry about all this," he said quietly. "Taking you to court, making a big deal about 2 feet of land, it seems pretty small now." John shook his head. "Land matters. Home matters. I understand wanting to be clear about what's yours. No hard feelings." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the sound of rain filling the room. John thought about Judge Grant and her father. How strange that a routine property dispute had led to this connection, this reminder of a time that had shaped his entire life. "Do you think about it often?" Doug asked suddenly. "Vietnam? The evacuation?" John looked out at the rain before answering. "Not every day anymore, but often enough. Certain sounds bring it back. Helicopters, fireworks on the 4th of July, sometimes the smell of diesel fuel or certain spices." Doug nodded, listening with genuine interest. "But I think about the family I helped that day more than the explosion," John continued. "The mother and her children. They sent me Christmas cards for years. The youngest boy, the one she named after me, he became a doctor. Works at a hospital in San Francisco now. Susan returned with papers for them to sign. The agreement was simple, just a few paragraphs stating that they accepted the current property line and fence location as legitimate and binding. As they signed, John felt a weight lifting. Not just the worry about his garden, but something deeper. The chance to share a bit of his story, to have it heard and respected, had given him a sense of peace he hadn't expected to find in a courthouse. "We should head back," Susan said, gathering the signed papers. "Judge Grant will want to formalize this agreement." As they left the mediation room, Doug once again moved behind John's wheelchair to help him navigate the hallway. "John, Doug," said as they approached the courtroom doors, "when this is all official, would you and Karen and I could have dinner sometime? I'd like to hear more about your service if you're willing to share, and about those prize-winning tomatoes." John smiled up at his neighbor, seeing him clearly for the first time. "I'd like that, Doug. I'd like that very much." When John and Doug returned to the courtroom with Susan, they found it had filled up a bit more. Word had spread through the courthouse about the emotional exchange between the disabled veteran and Judge Grant. Several court employees stood along. The back wall and a few lawyers who had finished their own cases had slipped in to watch. Officer Carter, the bailiff, gave John a small nod of acknowledgement as Doug wheeled him back to his spot. The clerk was already at her desk, typing quietly. The rain continued outside, but it had softened to a gentle patter against the windows. "All rise," Officer Carter called as Judge Grant re-entered the courtroom. Everyone stood except John, who straightened his posture and lifted his chin in the respectful manner he had shown earlier. Judge Grant's eyes found his immediately, and there was a warmth in her gaze that hadn't been there when court began. "Please be seated," she said, settling into her chair. "Mr. Peterson, Mr. Miller, I understand you've been working with our mediator. Has there been any progress?" Susan Matthews stepped forward, the signed agreement in her hand. "Your Honor, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Miller have reached a full agreement regarding their property dispute." Judge Grant's eyebrows rose slightly in pleasant surprise. "That's excellent news. Please approach and share the details." Susan handed the document to the clerk, who passed it to Judge Grant. The judge read it carefully, a small smile forming at the corners of her mouth. "So you've agreed to maintain the current fence line and property boundary as is," she summarized, looking up at both men. "Mr. Peterson, you're no longer seeking to move the fence 2 feet into what has been Mr. Miller's garden for many years?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Doug said, standing. "After speaking with Mr. Miller, I realized that being good neighbors is more important than 2 feet of land." Judge Grant nodded approvingly. "And Mr. Miller, you're satisfied with this resolution?" "Very much so, Your Honor," John replied. "I appreciate Mr. Peterson's willingness to work things out." Judge Grant studied the document for another moment, then set it down on her bench. "I see there's a note here about garden advice being exchanged, but that it's not a condition of the agreement." Doug smiled. "Just a neighborly gesture, Your Honor. My wife loves gardening, and Mr. Miller has offered to share some of his expertise, especially with his prize-winning tomatoes." A murmur of approval rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Judge Grant smiled fully now, the stern demeanor from earlier completely gone. "Well, this is exactly the kind of resolution the Court loves to see, she said. Neighbors working together to find common ground, quite literally in this case. She signed the bottom of the agreement. This settlement is approved and will be entered into the record. She tapped her gavel once. Case dismissed. Usually, this would be the end. People would gather their things and leave, moving on to the next case. But Judge Grant set her gavel down and removed her glasses again. Before we conclude today, she said, her voice softer than her judicial tone, I'd like to say something. The courtroom grew quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause. Mr. Miller, Judge Grant said, looking directly at John, our paths crossing today seems like more than coincidence. I believe in the legal system and the formal procedures we follow here. But I also believe in the power of human connection. John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. My father never considered himself a hero, she continued. He would say he was just doing his job. But I know from his private moments, from the nights when sleep wouldn't come, that what happened during those evacuations stayed with him his entire life. She paused, seeming to consider how much to share in this public setting. After my father passed away, I found his journals. He wrote about the Marines who stayed until the last possible moment, who put themselves at risk to save as many people as they could. He wrote about his admiration for their courage and his regret that he couldn't do more. John felt a lump forming in his throat. He remembered those final chaotic days so clearly, the desperation in the air, the difficult choices made in impossible circumstances. Your Honor, John said, his voice steady despite his emotion. Your father did everything he could. The USS Liberty took in more refugees than any other ship in the fleet. He saved thousands of lives. Judge Grant nodded, a sheen of tears visible in her eyes, though none fell. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Miller, and thank you for your service and sacrifice. Doug Peterson was watching this exchange with visible emotion. Several people in the small crowd were wiping their eyes discreetly. Your Honor, Doug said suddenly, standing again. If it's appropriate, I'd like to say something as well. Judge Grant nodded her permission. I came here today thinking only about property lines and legal rights, Doug said, looking around the courtroom before focusing on John. I didn't see my neighbor as a person with a history, with experiences that shaped him. I saw him as someone in my way. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Listening to Mr. Miller to John talk about his service, about what he gave for our country, it reminded me of my own father who served. It made me ashamed that I'd been so focused on 2 feet of land that I never took the time to know the man living next door to me. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the clerk had stopped typing to listen. I'm grateful for this experience today, Doug continued, not just because we resolved our dispute, but because it opened my eyes to what really matters. Good neighbors, shared stories, respect for each other's journeys. Judge Grant smiled warmly. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. The court appreciates your perspective. She looked around the courtroom, taking in the small crowd that had gathered. I think we've all witnessed something important today. A reminder that behind every case number, every legal filing, are real people with rich histories and experiences that deserve our respect and consideration. Officer Carter, the bailiff, was standing very straight now, his own military background evident in his posture. The clerk dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The observers along the back wall were nodding, in agreement with the judge's words. Court is adjourned, Judge Grant said, tapping her gavel once more. But instead of leaving immediately, she stood and stepped down from the bench, approaching John's wheelchair. The entire courtroom watched in surprise as Judge Patricia Grant, known for her strict adherence to protocol and formal demeanor, knelt beside John Miller's wheelchair to speak with him at eye level. Mr. Miller, she said softly, though in the silent room everyone could hear her. My father would have been honored to meet you. If you're willing, I'd like to show you something from his journals that I think would mean a lot to you. John nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. I would be honored, Your Honor. Judge Grant smiled at the formal address. Patricia, she said, please call me Patricia when we're not in session. She stood and turned to Officer Carter. Sam, would you please escort Mr. Miller and Mr. Peterson to my chambers? I'll join them shortly after I wrap up a few things here. Officer Carter nodded. Yes, Your Honor. As Doug once again moved to help with John's wheelchair, a spontaneous thing happened. One of the court employees in the back began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound growing until the entire courtroom was filled with applause. John felt his cheeks grow warm with embarrassment, but also with pride. Not pride for himself, but for all those who had served alongside him, for Captain Grant and his crew, for everyone who had been part of those difficult days so long ago. As Officer Carter led them toward the judge's chambers, Doug leaned down to speak quietly to John. I had no idea this morning would turn out like this, he said, shaking his head in wonder. I thought we'd argue about survey maps and property records for an hour and go home angry at each other. John looked up at his neighbor, now becoming a friend. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Sometimes in terrible ways, like losing my legs, and sometimes in wonderful ways, like today. Officer Carter opened a door marked Judge's Chambers and gestured them inside. Judge Grant will be with you shortly, gentlemen. Can I get either of you some water or coffee while you wait? Both men asked for water, and as Officer Carter left to get it, they found themselves in the private office of Judge Patricia Grant, surrounded by law books, family photos, and, John noticed with interest, a small display case containing naval medals and a folded American flag. Judge Grant's chambers were warm and inviting, different from the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with law books and family photos. A large wooden desk stood in the center of the room, neat and organized. Comfortable chairs were arranged in front of it, with space left open for John's wheelchair. John's eyes were drawn to the display case on the wall. Inside was a collection of naval medals, carefully arranged beside a folded American flag in a triangular frame. Next to these was a black and white photograph of a naval officer standing on the deck of a ship. Even without being told, John knew this must be Captain William Grant. Doug noticed John looking at the display. Is that her father? He asked quietly. John nodded. Has to be. I never met him in person, but his face was in the papers after the evacuation. He looks just like I remember. Officer Carter returned with 2 glasses of water, placing them on small coasters on a side table. Judge Grant will be with you shortly, he said, then stepped outside, closing the door behind him. John wheeled himself closer to the display case, studying the medals. The Navy Cross was there, along with several other high honors. Captain Grant had been a decorated officer. My father never displayed these in our home, Judge Grant said from the doorway. She had removed her judicial robe and now wore a simple, black suit. Without the robe, she looked less like a stern judge and more like a daughter proud of her father's service. He kept them in a drawer, she continued, walking into the room. Said he didn't do anything special, just his duty. It wasn't until after he passed that I found them and had them properly displayed. She moved to her desk, opening a drawer to remove a worn leather journal. Please, make yourselves comfortable. Doug took a seat in one of the chairs while John positioned his wheelchair alongside him. Judge Grant, Patricia, sat not behind her desk but in another chair, forming a small circle with them. My father kept journals his entire naval career, she explained, running her hand over the worn leather cover. Most were formal, almost like ship's logs, but this one was different. She opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed, with age, filled with neat, precise handwriting. This covers April 1975 during the fall of Saigon and the evacuation, she said. I've read it many times since his passing, trying to understand what he experienced. She turned to a specific page, marked with a small ribbon. This entry is from April 17th, the day you were injured, Mr. Miller. John, please, he said softly. She nodded with a small smile. John, and I'm Patricia when we're not in court. She looked down at the journal, then began to read aloud. April 17th, 1975. The Liberty has taken in 723 refugees today alone. We are well beyond capacity, but I cannot turn these people away. The Marines at the embassy are performing miracles, getting people out under increasingly dangerous conditions. The courage I am witnessing is beyond anything I have seen in my naval career." Patricia turned the page, continuing. "Today we received word that several Marines were injured during shelling near the embassy. One report described a Marine who shielded children with his own body during an explosion. The children survived and were evacuated to our ship. Their mother named the infant she was carrying after him. Such selflessness in the face of chaos reminds me why, despite the politics and the heartbreak of this war, I still believe in the fundamental goodness of our servicemen." John sat very still, his eyes fixed on the journal. Doug was watching him, seeing the emotion cross his face as he heard Captain Grant's words from that day. "That was you," Patricia said, looking up from the journal. "The Marine he wrote about. He never knew your name, but he never forgot what you did." John nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The memories were so clear now. The noise, the fear, the determination to get those children to safety. "I remember the family arriving on the ship," Patricia continued. "I was 12 years old. My father had brought me on this deployment. My mother had passed away the year before, and he couldn't bear to leave me with relatives. I stayed in his quarters most of the time. But when the refugees came aboard, I helped where I could, bringing water, finding blankets." She turned another page in the journal. "He wrote about you again later, after he learned you had survived but lost your legs." She read again. "The Marine who saved the children survived his injuries but lost both legs. When I told Kim, the mother," she wept. Then she asked if she could write to him. "I arranged it through channels." Her letter was simple but powerful. She told him that because of his sacrifice, her children would grow up free, that they would know his name and his courage, that her youngest son would carry his name with honor. Patricia closed the journal gently. "My father kept track of that family over the years. They settled in California. The boy named after you, John, became a doctor." John smiled, tears in his eyes. "Yes, I know. They sent me Christmas cards for many years. John graduated from medical school in 2001. Works at a hospital in San Francisco now." Doug was listening intently, clearly moved by the story unfolding before him. "Have you met him? The boy they named after you?" John shook his head. "No, we've exchanged letters but never met in person. He's invited me several times, but traveling is difficult with my condition, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I was ready to face those memories." Patricia reached out and placed her hand gently on John's arm. "I understand. My father was the same way. It took him years to talk about what happened during those final days. The people they couldn't save. The chaos of the evacuation. The feeling that they were abandoning people who had trusted them. We did the best we could," John said quietly. "All of us. Your father, the Marines, everyone." The room fell silent for a moment, each person lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunshine was beginning to break through the clouds. "I have something else to show you," Patricia said finally. She rose and went to her desk, opening another drawer. She removed a small yellowed envelope. "My father received this letter from Kim, the mother you saved, a few years before he died. She wanted him to know how her family was doing. She included this photo." She handed the envelope to John. With slightly trembling fingers, he opened it and removed a photograph. It showed a family, an older Asian woman surrounded by 3 grown children and several grandchildren. They were smiling, standing in front of a beautiful home with flowers in the garden. "That's them," John said, his voice full of wonder. "The children I carried, all grown up now." Doug leaned over to look at the photo. "Which one is John? The one named after you?" John pointed to a tall, serious-looking man in a doctor's coat standing beside his mother. "That must be him." Patricia smiled. "My father was so proud to receive that photo. He said it made everything worthwhile. All the difficult decisions, all the sleepless nights afterward, all the second-guessing about whether they could have saved more people." She took a deep breath. "John, I know this might be a lot to ask, but would you consider meeting them? The family? I've stayed in touch with them over the years, continuing my father's connection. They ask about you sometimes, especially young John. Well, not so young anymore." John looked at the photo again, at the faces of the children he had helped save so many years ago. Children who were now adults with their own families, their own lives. I think, he said slowly, that it might be time. After all these years. Doug spoke up. If you need help with transportation or anything, I'd be happy to help. Karen and I could drive you wherever you need to go. John looked at his neighbor with surprise and gratitude. Thank you, Doug, that means a lot. Patricia smiled, clearly pleased. I can arrange it if you'd like. A reunion, something small and private. John nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. I would like that very much. The sunshine was streaming through the windows now, filling the room with warm light. In that moment, something shifted for John. The weight of memories that had been both a burden and a shield for nearly 50 years felt lighter somehow. Not gone, never gone, but transformed into something he could carry more easily. You know, John said, looking between Patricia and Doug, when I woke up this morning, all I was worried about was 2 feet of garden space and some tomato plants. Doug laughed softly. And I was worried about property values and precise boundary lines. Patricia smiled, placing her father's journal back in the desk drawer. And I was prepared for a routine property dispute. Instead, we found connections none of us expected. She looked at the photo of her father on the wall, then back at John. My father used to say that the most important things in life are rarely what we think they're going to be, that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as ordinary moments. As they prepared to leave her chambers, Patricia asked if they would join her for lunch. There's a small cafe across from the courthouse. I'd like to hear more about both of you. Not as a judge, just as a person who values good company and meaningful conversation. Both men agreed readily. As they moved toward the door, John looked back at the display case with Captain Grant's medals and the photograph of the naval officer standing tall on the deck of his ship. In that moment, John felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The judge who had asked him to stand had given him something far more valuable than a favorable ruling on a property dispute.